How you doing, guys? Today we are working on the Clinton B1290. This is the Clinton motor off my buddy's wheel horse RJ, an RJ58, 59. It's specifically a 1959, and this was the original engine on it. In my last video I showed you how I surfaced the lifters or the tappets, however you want to call them. And in this video I was going to show you how I set the valve lash, but it got so cumbersome trying to make that video that I'm just going to explain it. I'm hoping that you find it interesting. So without further ado, here we go. The Clinton motor of this vintage is very similar in design to a Kohler K90 or a K91. You have a cam which rides on a pin in an iron block. There's valves, two valves obviously because it's a single cylinder. It is a flathead design and crankshaft on roller bearings. So essentially by design they're about the same. There might be some quality issues between the two, meaning the Clinton's not quite as good quality as a Kohler, but essentially the basic design is exactly the same, except for there are a couple things that are different from a Clinton engine compared to a Kohler K90 or a K91. One of which is this, the cam pin. In a Kohler motor, you press fit the cam pin from the from the bearing plate side through to the PTO side, and it press fits into the PTO side of the block. In a Clinton, it's the opposite. The cam pin goes through the PTO side and then press fits into the bearing plate side. So if you are trying to take a cam pin out of one of these early Clintons and you do it like a Kohler, you're heading down a world of hurt. And here's the reason why. Number one, you're forcing the pin, okay, through the entire press fit of the pin. In other words, you got to drag that pin all the way through the bearing plate side of the block. The second thing is this: because the PTO side of the block is not press fit, it's just a clearance fit, Clinton press fit a small plug into the block. It goes in right here, like that, okay? And the reason why they did that is so oil wouldn't weep through the pin out the block. Because with a clearance fit, obviously, eventually oil is going to migrate out that hole. So they put this plug in there, and they press fit the plug. Whoops! They press fit the plug in the block to keep oil from weeping. Makes sense. Except for if you work on a lot of Kohlers and you go to force the pin out because you think that it's press fit into the block, this oversized or slightly oversized plug then gets forced all the way down the center of your camshaft. Now, there's a couple things that can happen. One, you can basically extrude hone the inside of the cam, thus causing a couple thousandths of play within the cam, or I have seen it actually cracks the cam. As you're forcing everything out through the PTO side, it actually forces that plug through the camshaft, and ultimately it does crack it, like in the thinnest area. It cracks here or it'll crack at the end. So to eliminate that, you need to write it down on a piece of paper, because I forget about it, that there is that plug and the pin has to be pushed from the PTO side out, from the bearing plate side out the PTO side. Just a little tidbit. So with that, to do the valve lash, you obviously do not have the valve springs and the keepers and all that stuff in there. You're just going to drop them in onto your new seats. To do it correctly, I guess, I'm trying to get my thought here, sorry. You have to, one, don't put the valves in, just flip the block over, okay? You're going to drop your you're going to drop the lifters into the bore, okay? You want to be mindful here because you want to mark the one for the exhaust and mark the one for the intake. And the reason for that is when you start to grind the ends of the valves and you want to, you're all done with the valve lash, everything to that effect, and you want to then put everything back together, you got to lubricate it, right? So you got to take it all apart. Well, the valve lash is set to that lifter on that cam lobe right there. So you want to make sure that when you take it apart, whatever tappet or lifter was in the exhaust goes back in the exhaust and goes back into the intake. So with that being said, what you do is you just take the cam, drop the cam in, put the lifters in, mark them, drop the cam in. Obviously you take your pin, put your pin in, just give it a couple light taps with a hammer, just so it just starts to press fit into the block, okay? And that will hold your cam. You rotate the cam into the neutral position. In other words, the lifters are both in the down position, okay, neutral position. They're not up, they're not gonna actuate a valve. The next thing you do is then take your valves and drop them into the guides. With new valves, okay, the ends are quite long, so they may not even touch the seats. There might be just a hair airspace between that. And what that does is that tells you that you have to grind the end of the valve in order to get the proper clearance between the lifter and the valve stem itself. This is a kind of if you don't have like a real valve grinding machine or a valve stem grinding machine, this could be kind of tedious. I use my bench grinder. I know you're going to hiss and say, oh my God, you can't get a perfectly 90-degree angle from the face to the stem. I know that. But you just do the best that you possibly can do. That way, I think I jammed this. Yeah, I did. Oh, there it is. You do it the best that you can in order to get it straight. You just keep visually looking at it. I use the side of the grinding wheel. Again, very bad. Grinding wheels are not designed to be touched on the side. They're designed to be used on the round face. But you can't even get a straight grind if you use the round face. So I use the side of the grinding wheel with the end of the valve. Do I have a valve around here somewhere? I think I do. No, I don't. I think I threw the old valves away. But and then I'll just grind it, make sure that I keep it nice and straight. I always rotate it on the wheel, so that way on the side of the wheel, so that way if I am a little bit not square to the wheel, I kind of make the surface as square as possible. I put it back in, I see if there's any clearance. If there isn't, go back to the grinding wheel, just lightly kiss it on the grinding wheel, come back, put it back in, and then until, number one, the valve touches the seat and just barely touches the lifter. Now I know I'm there. I did pull out the Clinton book, or the copy of the book that I have, and the valve clearance for these is 9 thousandths to 10 thousandths. So with new seats, new valves, if I'm closer to 10 thousandths, that's really not that big of a deal. And the reason for that is as this engine runs, those valves are pounding onto the seat, they're breaking in, the clearance will close up. So I set the clearance for both these valves to 10 thousandths. And that was just trial and error, going back and forth, sticking the feeler gauge in there, making sure that the valve was on the seat, it wasn't popping up when I slid the feeler gauge in there. Constantly going back and forth until I got them in. Once I got them in, I take a little, or got it to spec, I could take the cam and the lifters out, making sure I marked which one was exhaust, which one was intake on the lifters, because each one of those faces that I faced, each one's a little thicker, a little thickness difference. So you want to make sure you put it back to the way you had set it up. So I made my marks, I knew everything, I took it back out, and then I installed the valves, which is basically just put the springs, the spring retainer, and then the keeper in the valve, and everything is copacetic. I did put the little popper breather back in. You absolutely have to have a popper breather in there. That's the little fiber disc that pops up and down as the piston goes up and down. It controls the oil that's going to be blown into the lifter gallery, or the valve gallery here. If you don't, it's just going to push so much oil up into this area, it's just going to blow out the breather. So make sure you have one of those. I put that back in. I'm about to install the camshaft, and one of the things that is a little interesting is, you know, the cam has these little weights on it, and those are the governor weights, obviously. The little tang here rides on the bottom side of one of these little discs, and the disc actually kind of rides inside the weight like this. And obviously, as RPM is increased, these weights will fly out. As they fly out, they push the disc in and out. That disc then presses onto the governor shaft, and that closes or opens the throttle. One of the little tricks to get this thing to work, or to get this together, is locate your pin. Okay, this pin keeps this disc from rotating. You just kind of locate it, you slide it on, and then you just kind of wiggle it a little bit, give it a little bit of push here and there, like this, and then just boom, it goes right in. And it's the easiest way to get the weights back in place onto the camshaft. Obviously, slide this in just as I indicated. You slide the pin in from the PTO side. I put it in my dake press and just give it a little bit of a press just to press it through. It will protrude when all finished. The cam pin will protrude from the bearing bearing plate side. Sorry, just a little bit. That's perfectly acceptable. Make sure that it's squeaky clean. Use a lot of engine assembly lube on this, and I use like Primitex from AutoZone, like real engine assembly lube. I put a ton of white grease all over the lobes. I'll put assembly lube on the stems of the lifters. I'll put a little bit of white grease on the base of the lifter, so that way it has a little bit of grease for startup. I usually use bearing grease on the stems of the valves, so that way they're lubricated, because it will take a little bit of run time in order to get oil up into those guides. So I usually use just straight bearing grease. Lasts a long time, can take the heat for a while in order to get that oil up in there. For the crank was all washed and cleaned. I polished this with the crank pin. I polished that with a little 4.0 steel wool, cleaned it all up. I will put assembly lube all over the bearings. Obviously, assembly lube on the gear will set the timing by the timing marks. I ran a die over the end of the crank to make sure that all the threads are good. I shoe shined everything with like 320 sandpaper to make sure on the ends. So number one for the PTO, so the pulleys and stuff will go on. Cleaned everything up here so that way the flywheel will sit nice on it. What else? That's about it. So next is to start assembling the motor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the camshaft in just as I indicated. The lifters will go in. I'm going to put the crankshaft in. I'm going to set the end play with the bearing plate. I just got to clean the bearing plate. That is adjusted by the gasket thicknesses. And then I'm going to put the piston down the tube, and the motor will be pretty much all done except for doing the ignition system. I was hoping to have it done this weekend for a little meet and greet in Danbury, Connecticut, but it looks like the weather's not going to hold out, and I've already talked to the owner of the motor, and I already kind of told him that, timing wise it might not be done. So I'll probably meet up with him probably at the Wheel Horse show, hopefully before, that way he can put his tractor together, but we'll probably be down at the Wheel Horse show before this thing is actually pretty much finished. I'll show a video of it running. Hopefully it runs, hopefully it doesn't smoke like a chimney. It shouldn't, but you never know until you actually put fuel in the tank and fire in the hole. Alright guys, you have a great day. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. And if you find this interesting, please tell a friend. Have a nice day.